Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael McDonald. I'm an associate here in Berlis. Thank you very much for joining us today. I am here with Colin Drouin, who's an executive director with an organization called Pride at Work, based out of Toronto here in Ontario. And I'm also here with Michael Horvat, a partner at our firm that works in our employment group and does a fair bit of work with the Human Rights Tribunal. As many of you probably know, this month is the month in which we celebrate Pride, and this year we actually celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots that occurred originally back in New York City. And in commemoration of this month, we are just having a discussion today to discuss some of the challenges faced by the LGBTQ community, as well as specifically dealing with the barriers to employment, as well as discrimination that may be faced by some of the members of the community in the workplace. So first we'll be going through having a discussion with Colin Drouin to discuss the nature and the context of the issues that are being faced by the community, and then we'll be moving on to discuss with Michael Horvat to provide a bit of context on the framework, the legal framework that's in place in Ontario, as well as how employers and employment situations can deal with some of these issues. So now I'll be passing it over to Colin Drouin to start the conversation.
Thanks very much, Michael. Like Michael said, my name's Colin Drouin. I'm the Executive Director of Pride at Work Canada. The pronouns I use are he, him, and his. We'll talk about that introduction in a little bit. Pride at Work Canada is a not-for-profit member services agency. We work directly with employers across Canada to support their diversity inclusion strategy as it pertains to the grounds that we'll be talking about today. Just to give folks a little bit of context as to how we work with queer and trans communities and with other community organizations. Like I said, Pride at Work Canada is a not-for-profit member service agency. Our focus is advocacy and education. We also work closely with other types of organizations that serve the same community. So we have Community as an example of a client services agency. They're BC's Queer, Trans, and Two-Spirit Resource Center. They provide social services to members of the community in the region of British Columbia. Halifax Pride is an example of a Pride festival. There's probably close to 200 Pride festivals across Canada. These are usually either not-for-profit or charitable organizations that are independently operated. Folks within Ontario might be familiar with large organizations like Pride Toronto, but we also see smaller Pride festivals happening across the country from May until September. And then we've got organizations like Travel Gay Canada, which is a business association for LGBTQ2+ owned businesses within the travel industry. So I'd just like to provide a little bit of context and remind folks that there's many different types of organizations within this community, and we all kind of focus on very different pieces of the same pie. At Pride at Work Canada, we focus specifically on employment and the workplace. And one of the reasons why we do this is because we see a lot of workplace discrimination against folks who are queer and trans in Canada. We did a survey a couple of years ago, and we found the experience of people who are LGBTQ2+ to be quite different from how they were perceived by people who were not members of the community. As you can see from the stat here, a large number of members of the community experienced discrimination and harassment in the workplace, while folks who don't identify as members of the community had the perception that things were fine, there was no discrimination whatsoever, nothing to worry about. So it's this disconnect that we see contribute to some not so great workplace cultures, and how one of the reasons why we do the work that we do. Another reason why we do the work that we do is limited access to employment. Not a huge number of Canadians identify as members of the community that we work with. I think if you look at sample groups that are much younger, you see higher percentages of folks identifying these days. But the fact is that we're not a huge group of the Canadian population, but we do make up a quarter of the homeless population in Canada, which points to a number of issues related to employment and housing. We do find that for youth in the community, perhaps without the supportive network of their families, that they find it difficult to get their first job. It doesn't start them on the best career path, so we see that contributing to some of these numbers. There was a research study that was based in Ontario called TransPulse that was done a couple of years ago. The Canadian Human Rights Commission is now looking at doing it nationwide, but at least just in Ontario a couple of years ago, we did find, or TransPulse did find, that a large number of people who identify as trans, even though they have post-secondary education, their average income is about $15,000 per year or less. So we see a lot of issues related to even just accessing employment. So, in the previous stat, we talked a little bit about, the workplace culture, and we use that phrase all the time, bring your whole self to work. Well, we actually see a number of people who aren't actually able to get into the workplace to begin with. So one of the things that people ask about all the time is the really long acronym that we use to talk about the community. You might see LGBT, you might see, LGBTQ2+, or even longer ones, and people wonder sometimes aloud why there are so many different identities in the community. And I always like to ask people, how would you describe the sky if there's no word for the color blue? You ask people this question and you see all kinds of them do all kinds of mental gymnastics trying to figure out, maybe I say it's the same color as the ocean, maybe I just say it's expansive, but they're really just trying to figure out what they can compare that sky to, so they don't actually have to refer to the color itself. And that's really one of the reasons why you see all of the different identities that you see under this umbrella. And here on this slide, you'll see just a number of examples. This is by no means exhaustive, but it's a grouping of some of the different types of identities or descriptions that we've seen in the community. We at Pride at Work Canada, you can see along the left column there, we use LGBTQ2+ for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, two-spirit, and then plus to kind of represent plurality. And I won't go through an exhaustive definition of each of these identities, because the fact is that as soon as you define one of these terms, you're going to meet 10 people who define it just a little bit differently. And one of the things that Pride at Work Canada that we actually find fascinating is all of these different definitions and how different people use this combination of terms to articulate their sexual orientation, their gender identity, and gender expression. So we think it's much more helpful to go through the grounds that we work with, rather than giving everybody these very specific definitions, because as you'll see from some of the other content that we go through, recognizing, listening to somebody's identity and just kind of mirroring that language back to them is usually the best way of interacting with somebody on their specific identity, but it's knowledge of the grounds that we work with and the broad ways that challenges related to those grounds are manifested in the workplace that's going to be really helpful. So one of the first kind of distinctions that we make when we look at the grounds that we work with is the difference between sex and gender. So we see sex, sex is really a medical classification that's usually used more in a medical context, and it's usually assigned at birth based on the physicality of a child when they're born. And then we think of gender and gender expression as more lived concepts. So gender, whereas sex is a little bit more about medical classification and physicality, gender is a little bit more about lived experience and how one participates with stereotypes associated with being a man, a woman, or not subscribing to either of those stereotypical gender roles. Gender is not something that you can see, touch, hear. It's something that's more ephemeral, whereas gender expression are some of the more tangible ways that we express the gender that we feel that we are, and how we communicate that to the outside world. And we've got a quote here from Julia Serrano, who is a trans activist. And it's really, I think it's very representative of how we think of these definitions between sex and gender. She says that we make assumptions every day about other people's genders without ever seeing their birth certificates, their chromosomes, their genitals, their reproductive systems, their childhood socialization, or their legal sex. There's no such thing as a real gender. There is only the gender we experience ourselves as and the gender we perceive others to be. So, it's a very good reminder that, you don't often, see your coworkers without their clothes on. So what's going on underneath their clothes has very little to do with how you work with them. And it's really about the expression that people put forward and the way that people need to communicate with you to feel respected that we focus on. So we really do in the workplace focus on the lived gender rather than someone's medical sex. And then when we look at some kind of respectful language best practices, we could do a 1 or 2 hour webinar just on respectful language, but these are some of the things that we see come up most often for folks who are just learning about the community. I introduced myself with my pronouns at the beginning of the webinar today, and sometimes we hear people talk about their preferred pronouns. We just say that people have pronouns. A pronoun is, a word that you use to stand in for your name. He, she, they are examples of pronouns. And it's when somebody offers up the pronouns that they use, it's not really a preference. It's just that's the type of the words that you should be using to make them feel respected. We don't use words like sex change. That's something I hear come up a lot. We use terms like gender affirming care, gender confirming care, transition-related care. There's no single operation that one goes through to transition gender. It's medical steps to transition are very varied, and some folks might never take medical steps but still be considered trans. We see the word transgendered used a lot, which makes it sound like somebody was put into a transgender machine and some sort of procedure was done on them. It's also grammatically incorrect. If somebody is Italian-Canadian, you don't say they're Italian-Canadian. They didn't have the Italian inflicted upon them like it was some sort of illness. That's simply a part of their identity. So you don't have to say in the past tense somebody's transgendered. You just say that somebody's trans. And you would never say that somebody's trans unless that was a definition that they applied to themselves. We have some other examples here just about talking about folks being, male-bodied, female-bodied, a real man, a real woman. That's why we use some of those terms like assigned at birth, or we use qualifiers like cis man, trans man. Trans man maybe means that a person has had transition-related experience where perhaps they identified as a different gender, and now they identify as a man. And cis is short for cisgender, which is an easy way of saying that someone is not trans. So I myself don't have any experience of being trans. I identify myself as a cisgender man. Like I said, I'm talking about pronouns, just to give you some examples of how we can transition some phrases from using gender-specific pronouns to gender-neutral pronouns, which can be very helpful. If you don't know the pronouns that somebody uses, at Pride at Work Canada, we put all of our pronouns on our email signatures so that folks know how to interact with us. Sometimes it's helpful if you're not sure what pronouns someone uses to just make sure that the language that you're using is gender-neutral. We have an example of a phrase at the bottom of the slide here. On the left, you see that we know that Lauren's pronouns are she and her, and we use them liberally throughout the phrase. And then in the second example on the right, we're not quite sure of Lauren's pronouns, so in this case we would use the gender-neutral, they, their, them, in the singular, which is completely acceptable. When you're not sure about pronouns, you can always ask. You can't tell someone's name or pronoun just by looking at them. Obviously, you don't know somebody's name, so how would you know their pronoun just by looking at them unless they have a name tag? And if you find yourself unsure, you can be attentive to how other people refer to the person, see if perhaps they have it on their name tag or in their email signature. The other things that are really important to remember are respect and practice. So, if somebody actually takes the time to let you know their name and pronoun, it's important for you to mirror that language back to them so that they know that you listen to them. And if you have difficulty using someone's pronoun and name, you should practice, maybe when they're not around, and make sure that you accept it gracefully when they point out that you've made a mistake. We have an example here of some of the best practice that we use at Pride at Work Canada, where we add pronoun field to a name tag. We also provide pronoun stickers that people can add to their name tags at our events. Similarly, we like to avoid use of gender titles where possible, making assumptions about honorifics like Mr. and Miss that people might use. We only use those gender-specific titles if we've confirmed how somebody wishes to be addressed or if we know for a fact. And I have just some examples here of gender-neutral ways of introducing oneself. Instead of saying, ladies and gentlemen, you can perhaps just say, how can I help you today? What's your name? What would you like support with? These are really easy phrases to give to folks in customer service or front-facing roles when you want to make sure that they're using language that's inclusive. The other ground that we work with in the space is sexual orientation. And sexual orientation is how all individuals articulate who they have relationships with, who they have sex with, who they're attracted to. And it's important not to make assumptions about people's orientation based on their current partner, previous relationships, or how they look, because you can't tell somebody's sexual orientation just by looking at them. Similar to when we talk a little bit about gender and gender identity, gender expression, there's some respectful language that we prefer folks to use. Starting with yourself. So, you can have. Sexual preference is the actual term that we find most vexing. The sexual preference is really describing what you might like to do when you're having sex with another person, so it's usually not appropriate for the workplace. What we're talking about is sexual orientation or just someone's orientation, and that's just a little bit more about somebody's identity rather than what they actually like to do sexually. So it's a little bit more appropriate for the workplace to talk about one's orientation rather than one's preferences. We don't really like to use the medicalized term homosexual if possible. You can use gay, lesbian, or just whatever identity the individual identifies with. There's an organization that takes Associated Press articles and finds and replaces the word gay with the word homosexual. It's not really helpful when you're talking about perhaps the Olympic runner Tyson Gay. His name gets changed to Tyson homosexual for the whole article. It changes the context. So you can't just take one word and replace it with another and expect the context to remain. You see a lot of different words for the community that we work with. Gay community was the first one, then you saw expanded gay and lesbian, then maybe gay, lesbian, bisexual. Now we see longer acronyms like LGBTQ2+, or other even longer acronyms. Usually I will just use that acronym and say that community, queer and trans communities, queer, trans, two-spirit communities. Like I said, as soon as you find somebody who's got the exact definition for one of these phrases, you're going to find 10 people who have totally different ones. So we encourage organizations to locate a name for the community that works for them. We also don't really understand the term gay lifestyle. We find there's no specific lifestyle that is common among all people in the community, so we don't really tend to use this term. Having respectful conversations across the board, it's always important to start with yourself. So if you're asking for information about somebody, perhaps be prepared to offer up that same information about yourself. So we've got an example here, Radima. She would really like to know someone's pronouns, so she's offering up that information about herself. She says, my name is Radima, my pronouns are she and her, what about you? So it's just a good way of making sure that you're not asking anybody any questions that you wouldn't answer yourself. It's also important leading with the why. If you are creating client profiles and you want to add people's pronouns, just be transparent with the individual about, that's why you're doing it. You want to make sure that you're able to serve them effectively in the future. And the phrase I've used several times, mirroring language, you listen to how somebody refers to themselves, or you listen to the words that people use, and you just try and make sure that you're using the same words when you're referring to the same people. And don't make assumptions, because you don't want to make assumptions based on limited information and perhaps be in a situation where your assumption was wrong. We also just like to think about, just because you want to know something about someone doesn't mean that you have the right to ask about it. We see trans people in both Canada and the U.S. reporting high levels of violence, harassment, discrimination. There's a couple of examples here related to mental health and wellness. There's a lot of stress associated with being a member of this community, constantly being asked very personal, perhaps medical questions that other people wouldn't be asked, questions about your relationships or your sex life that perhaps you wouldn't get if you weren't straight, or if you were straight, or if you weren't trans. So it's just important to think, if you want to ask somebody about their transition, maybe think about whether or not it's appropriate to discuss medical history. If you'd be perfectly happy discussing maybe some of the prescriptions you're on, some of the surgical procedures you've had at work. And if you want to ask about somebody's sexual practices, maybe just think about whether it would be acceptable to talk about this with a straight person at work, and it usually isn't, and you probably wouldn't want to have those discussions at work. And if there's information like somebody's medical sex, if you're not a healthcare provider or a researcher dealing with a person in a clinical setting, it's probably not the best thing to ask someone. You want to talk about somebody's lived gender, not their medical sex. But, you know, at the end of the day, everyone makes mistakes, so we're fully aware of that. And when you make one, you want to find a balance between owning that error and fixing the situation. You know, one of the things that we see people do, perhaps if they misgender someone, is go into hysterics and, I'm so sorry, I can't believe I did that. And they really just make it all about them. And it really makes the member of the community that we work with feel kind of uncomfortable because they feel like just by being who they are, they've really inconvenienced somebody. So, you know, it's okay to make mistakes, you know, just fully apologize for them and move on. And just remember that it's not the duty of every LGBTQ2+ person to educate you. So if you have a question, you know, there's webinars like this. We've got lots of great resources on our website that we'll go over at the end of the session today. And there's a lot of great information out there. Just because you happen to be talking to a queer person doesn't mean that that's your chance to ask every question that you've ever had of that person, because guess what? We're not all experts. We only are experts in ourselves usually, and you usually have to look for some broader educational materials to get the full breadth of the community. And that's it for me. I'm happy to come back in a bit and answer any questions that folks might have.
All right, thank you very much, Colin. We'll now move over to Michael Horvat to discuss the legal framework as to how this is set up and the interactions with the Human Rights Tribunal as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Colin. I'm going to take off where Colin left off, and in part, the information and the detail that Colin provided everyone today is really important with respect to understanding how that practicality, that information, that background, that understanding then becomes part of a workplace culture and a workplace attitude that then promotes and respects differences in the Human Rights Code. It really is trying to impassion or trying to introduce a virtuous circle. If you have knowledge of the situation, if you have an understanding of the situation, and you have an application of that knowledge and understanding, then you're into a situation where policies, procedures, and practices are not something that you have to pull off a shelf. It is just something that you understand within the workplace and can apply on an as-needed and a timely basis. And in some sense, the legal descriptions that we're using today in and of themselves are somewhat antiquated, but we are still using them, and I want to provide the better context where dealing with trans and issues within the workplace are not a situation that is dire or can lead to a misunderstanding. It is something that human resource professionals can introduce very effectively, and not from a perspective of difference, but from a perspective of inclusion. So the Human Rights Code as itself prevents or promotes the fact that discrimination is not permitted in the workplace, nor is harassment permitted in the workplace. Every person has a right to equal treatment under the code, particularly with respect to sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. But when it comes to terminology, the word that we often use within employment circles is accommodation. And in some sense, it's the wrong word to use, but if we break it down, it seems more appropriate. Accommodation seems to be, there seems to be a baseline, and we have to make differences or make changes to accommodate someone else with a difference. And really, that's not what accommodation is about. Whether it's in disability or gender identity or gender expression, accommodation is about removing workplace barriers that prevent qualified employees from performing and participating in the workplace, period. It's just about understanding that some individuals, because of history or practice, have workplace barriers that need to be brought down. And in the context of your workplaces, this should address issues of sex, sexual orientation, transgender, well, trans, sexual identification, there's an error there that I've now corrected, family status and marital status. So really what we're talking about is within your obligations under the code and your legal obligations, in order to promote also a more inclusive workplace, it's about understanding the process. Procedural right and a substantive right. Oftentimes, this following simply the process is often the best, first, and last step that is often necessary in workplaces in order to address issues that come up, because it requires an employer to make the inquiries with respect to the particular employee situation, whether that's brought to you by the employee themselves or whether you've identified it as a human resource professional, or whether some management has provided to you, or whether a client has identified the issue. You want to be able to have the understanding and power and, quite frankly, just the fortitude to go up to the individual and say, we understand this is a concern that you've raised, or someone has raised it in your concern on your behalf. Let's talk about it. Let's address the situation, because we want to be able to promote a more inclusive workplace, and we want you to be a better, more involved employee. And we don't want to create or allow barriers to preventing you from enjoying your participation in the workplace. And then it requires a substantive obligation to follow through on that. Oftentimes you will find that once you've made that first introduction inquiry and determine what the individual's priorities are, what the workplace priorities are, you'll find that you have some ability to then determine courses of action that will address those issues within the workplace, often for the betterment of everybody, making the workplace a more inclusive environment for everyone. It is a multi-party inquiry, so it includes not just human resources or management, includes the individual who's going to be the subject or involved in the process, and it also includes, if you're a unionized environment, it'll include a union working on behalf of employees to facilitate a resolution. When it comes to accommodation, the test is very high. What an employer is obligated to do, the threshold is to the point of undue hardship. This will not include financial cost. It won't include possible disruption to a collective agreement. And most importantly, it won't include what the opinions of other employees are, particularly if they're the ones creating the barriers. When it comes to undue hardship, the obligation is on the employer to make sure that the code and its policies are respected and that that information is disseminated to other employees. And if other employees raise an issue, then it's the employer's obligation to inform those employees of the resolution and essentially to say, this is the way it's going to be, and if you don't want it, you don't like it, there's the door. It can be as direct and as simple as that. It's not going to include, however, other issues that may affect safety within the workplace or the creation of a new position, or simply, the performance of economic duties. We don't have a position for the individual, but we'll have this person occupy a space that actually doesn't result in anything. The resolutions are not intended to be symbolic. They are intended to be practical with respect to the individual's performance of their ability to contribute to the workplace. The most recent changes to the Human Rights Code occurred in 2012, and these were the changes that introduced gender identity and gender expression. I want to address the 2012 situation. That is both a long time ago and a short time ago. When you think about it from the perspective of how far we've come with respect to identifying these issues and how workplaces have moved towards inclusionary policies, understanding their obligations, and engaging employees who may be trans, lesbian, gay, with respect to their inclusion in the workplace, such that at some point the goal being that it's not going to be an issue, quite frankly. And some of the statistics that Colin identified, changes in pay, issues of stress, workplace harassment, that the understanding is that if you've got more respect, more knowledge in the workplace, those lead to prevention or elimination of those events in the workplace. And that means that you've got, basically, you're dealing with he, him, her, she, they, all together without an understanding that there was ever a difference. That's the goal with respect to workplace policy and procedure. And we can both say we've come a long way from 2012, and in some sense we haven't come that far. As far as legal definitions, because I'm a lawyer and we deal with the Human Rights Code and we deal with the Human Rights Commission, so we do have to rely on legal definitions that unfortunately don't necessarily change as quickly as necessarily as we need them to. But the Ontario Human Rights Commission has outlined a good set of definitions for understanding gender identity, gender expression, and trans, or transgender. They still actually use that term. So it is more encompassing and open-ended, and it provides an understanding and in a starting place for workplaces when they're thinking about developing policies, understanding policies, training their employees on these policies, and then being able to handle questions of accommodation and potentially investigations regarding harassment and discrimination in the workplace. This is the good baseline to take from, so that when you're engaging in both your substantive and procedural obligations to your employees, that you're starting from the correct baseline and you're asking the right questions and you're making the right inquiries of the individuals involved. So with respect to the Commission itself and their policy on discrimination and harassment because of gender identity and gender expression, they describe it as follows. Gender identity is linked to an individual's intrinsic sense of self, and particularly the sense of being male or female. Gender identity may or may not conform to a person's birth-assigned sex. The personal characteristics that are associated with the gender identity include self-image, physical and biological appearance, expression, behavior, conduct, as they relate to gender. And when you think of those components, these are all components of how a person identifies to the world. And part of their world is going to be the workplace. It's where we spend at least a third of our time and half our lives, a third of our time during the day and half our lives over our lives. So if they're not included, if we're not breaking barriers for them for inclusion purposes, then you can see how stress, harassment, discrimination will increase for those individuals. And you know, if you want to get very frank about it, it's also bad economics. It's bad economics. You're losing opportunity to include people who are going to help your business, who are going to be, who may be the stars of your business, and you're not providing an opportunity for them to participate and make sure that the barriers that they're facing can be knocked down. To get into some case law, and I think, you know, again, when I refer to the sort of 2012, both being a long time ago and a little time ago, you know, this is one of the cases that led to, quite frankly, the change in the Human Rights Code that introduced gender identity into one of the protected grounds. And it is a quite vivid example of how bad actors and bad actions lead to good law. So this is involved an employee who transitioned from living as a man to a woman during her employment. After she advised her employer that she was beginning the process of sex transition, a number of issues arose. First off, the most common issue is going to be washroom, change room. How do we deal with that with respect to someone who's in the midst of transition? Secondly, clearly, at this point in time, because of the work environment, she felt that she was going to be under an increased view of potential harassment or discrimination, and she felt that it was a safety issue for her as she was transitioning to avoid using the men's change room or the men's washroom, and particularly, quite frankly, to avoid unnecessary comments from employees who were not welcoming to a trans person within the workplace. So she advised that she was undergoing this harassment, and that, quite frankly, it was leading to a situation where she was no longer comfortable coming to work because it was a poison work environment. Strikingly and unfortunately, the company took the position at the time that it did not have to make a change in the situation. It did not have to make a change in respect of accommodation because she had not, quote, legally transitioned yet to a woman, that she was still in the midst of transitioning and therefore had to, quote, prove she was a female before she would be treated as a woman in the workplace and allowed access to female change rooms and female washroom. Ultimately, it led to a situation where she reacted to her coworkers, and she was the one who was terminated on the basis of her attitude and the fact that she was engaging in workplace conduct. Understanding, quite frankly, that the workplace conduct itself that she was alleged to have engaged in was only in reaction to what she was facing in the workplace. So when you apply it to the law now and of the time, this is where it's clear that the employer messed up on a couple of situations. First off, they simply just messed up on the substantive and procedural obligations. They made no inquiry with her as to what she wanted, as to what was possible within the workplace and what could be disseminated and trained with respect to other employees in the workplace. And they made no effort with respect to a substantive resolution other than stating that until such time as she was legally or had finished a transition, that she would be treated as a woman and the company was not going to do anything until then. And quite frankly, and quite correctly, the tribunal said, notwithstanding the fact that at the time it wasn't even part of the code, that gender identity and accommodation could be a difficult and evolving issue, but it was one that had to be addressed by the workplaces. And the tribunal said as follows: "This is not meant to suggest that in any circumstance and upon request a transgender person must necessarily be treated in exactly the same manner as others with their lived gender. The issues involved in addressing transitions in the workplace may be complex, in particular regarding the use of washrooms or locker rooms. Society typically divides facilities based on sex, and separate use of such facilities is linked to notions of privacy, identity, public decency, and sexuality. Issues about what human rights legislation requires in terms of treatment of transgendered, intersex, transsexual, and other gender identities in areas that have been divided by sex have been and doubtless will continue to be the subject of litigation and analysis under human rights legislation." So this is the tribunal saying, this is the start of the discussion. We now have to address this in the workplace, and they did so. They essentially said, at this point in time, you have to identify these individuals, you have to identify these circumstances, you have to engage the people who are involved, and you have to create solutions. And when it comes to creating solutions and what employers should do, the first thing is to get information. Get the medical support, get the documents, timelines, but accommodation doesn't need to be dependent upon a future change versus current identification. You don't need to wait for the end result. It's what the person is feeling and dealing with currently that needs to be respected and identified in the workplace as being a part of the accommodation process. Understand what is being requested in these circumstances. The best person to talk to is the person who is either the subject of the discrimination or is bringing the issue to light. Is this as simple as identification of a new name? Is it a change of nameplate, email address, pronoun, identification? Work with the individual to understand where the concern is. Is this an issue with respect to dress code? As long as the dress code itself is not related to safety in the workplace, then identify this. Is this an individual who, as part of the transition process, is now dressing as their identified sex? Understand whether or not your dress code itself has inadvertently divided on the base of sexual identity, and address it with the individual and address it within your policy. Consider the use of an all-gender or inclusion of an all-gender washrooms. So instead of having separate washrooms for male and female, have just washrooms that have doors on them and that anyone can access. Review privacy options when related to change rooms. What is the best option and accommodation, and work with the individual, work within your workplace. Clearly, it's not going to be an option to say change in the car or change in the parking lot. That is not respectful of the situation, and it is not going to break down any barrier with respect to this individual participating in the workplace. And then work with the employee regarding messaging and communication. If that's a concern for this employee, then work with the employee. Understand how the employee wants this to be communicated to their colleagues, and help with respect to the introduction with colleagues. And then limit disclosure, respect the privacy of the individual involved, because they're going to tell you things that they don't expect you to communicate to anyone else other than alleviating their stress within the workplace. They may tell you things in confidence that you should keep in confidence, and understand that it's being provided to you in confidence. Remember to respect the process and the person. That's the fundamental building block. I do want to talk briefly, although it's a little bit outside, but I do want to talk briefly about family status discrimination, because I mean, this is sort of a longer term with respect to marriage and marriage equality. And quite frankly, this is a situation where most workplaces were probably ahead of the curve before legal changes came introduced in Canada with respect to marriage equality. But understand that within the workplace, marriage equality therefore also reflects family and protections relating to marital and family status. So, marital status is defined as being married, single, widowed, divorced, or separated, and includes the status of living with a person in a conjugal relationship outside a marriage, and that necessarily includes both same-sex and opposite-sex relationships. And family status is defined as being a parent and being in a parent and child relationship, and there's no distinction between birth or adoptive parents. It is simply that familial relationship that is important here. However, understand that as far as the legal restriction is concerned, it does not yet extend to other family relationships, so aunt, uncle, brother, sister, and it doesn't necessarily translate into other caregiver situations. And the biggest one there, sort of being separated out at this point, is if you are not yet a legally adoptive parent. There may be limitations with respect to a parent-child relationship that is not related to your participation within the household in the care of that child. When we talk about family status, it is a growing element simply because of the fact that familial obligations and marital obligations are growing within the society. We have, quite frankly, a growing sandwich generation that has both care for elderly parents as well as children. And you've got businesses who are trying to keep up with the times. Really, when this case law started and when these issues started, a lot of it was focused on the parent and child relationship, and less was given to elder care and to parents and grandparents. So what you're seeing now is a focus on understanding that there are outside obligations that employers need to understand and need to accommodate in order to facilitate, again, break down barriers to allow their employees to participate in the workplace. So the one difference here in this accommodation process is what we are seeing in this marital status and family status requirements is a lot more onus on the employees themselves to think of alternatives and to try to self-help and have self-help remedies. They simply can't come to you and say, well, my child is now starting hockey or dance or is in a music recital and I need to take every Friday off. Sorry about that. There has to be a process of understanding whether this is a requirement. And regular listeners to these podcasts know that you can have situations where, music for this child is not a passion project, it's a medical requirement because the music actually may, you may have a child who suffers from a form of autism, and the music actually is part of this child's ability to interact with and break down barriers with respect to their interaction with their friends, and it is actually part of the medical treatment that they're undergoing. So when you're involved in that situation, understand, ask questions, but also the onus is on the employee. What alternatives have they looked at? If they're in a relationship, have they talked about alternate other care arrangements? Has the spouse looked at opportunities with respect to scheduling in their employment? And can they provide help? Is there daycare opportunities? It may cost the employee. This is one of the situations where employees can be put to a cost or an expectation that they're going to have to incur some cost with respect to their home care, nursing, or daycare. But at least they have to have looked at that option and attended to that option. And then it's a determination of what can the employer do. Are there changes in scheduling. The person can't work Friday, but they can work Saturday. You happen to be a 24/7 operation, and you do have work on the weekends. You know, it cannot be just to the employee to say, well, I like my weekends free. If they're switching off days, that can be an appropriate accommodation. And it may actually end up that the employee to be accommodated needs to also take a financial hit on that, in the sense that the Friday off is not with compensation. It may not be replaced, but it doesn't necessarily and doesn't need to be paid. So really what you're talking about here is that it's not about preference. It is about addressing a disadvantage that can be overcome within the workplace by accommodation. As a takeaway, we want to let you know that this law right now is fluid. We are seeing greater emphasis now on employers in the process of understanding procedure. Make the inquiries. That's where often the process, and quite frankly, where companies get in trouble, is they actually don't engage their employees to understand the situation. And put your employees on notice with respect to the law. Tell them, we're not objecting to your request or to an understanding, but we want you to provide the information we need, and we want to understand what alternatives you've engaged before you've come to us, or in light of coming to us, what we can deal with together. So communication and having a clear understanding of the employee's needs is going to be important to understanding what accommodation can be provided. At the end of the day, when it comes to these kinds of accommodation, understanding, and inclusion within the workplace, process is important. Take all requests seriously. Understand what the person is requesting, and understand what the employer and what the workplace can do. Take the time to consider, investigate alternatives, and what you can do as far as goodwill, because your employee is going to, you have to approach the employee with the understanding the employee has goodwill, and you should be approaching it with goodwill too. Consider temporary arrangements, see what can work and what doesn't work, and ensure, please ensure that when an employee asserts their rights, brings forward concerns, that they're not subject to unsquare scrutiny or reprisal. And it's really helpful to you and to the process to document everything. It's going to be helpful for you in the future as well in dealing with these ongoing issues within the workplace, because you are going to have other people who come forward and say, I need accommodation for my child, my grandparent, or this is what's happened to me in the workplace. This is the name calling I'm having. I need this to be addressed because it's affecting my health. All that past experience is going to help you in the future to address it, and really encourage more dialogue within the workplace to the point where you may be the one who is surprised by the fact that introducing an issue and training amongst your staff is going to be, well, of course this is what we would do. Why would we do anything else? And that's the goal we're kind of striving for with respect to how both the law and how practicality of people's situations can be addressed in the workplace.
Thank you very much, Michael. So we'll now be spending some time to address some of the questions that have been coming in from our audience. I encourage you to continue sending questions. Just in case we don't get to everything today, we will possibly send out some materials after the fact to address the questions coming in. I guess we'll just start going through the list here. So firstly, Colin, Pride at Work kind of takes on a bit of a quasi-consultation role with its regional and national partners in terms of how to address some of these issues. One of the ones that I've seen a couple of questions come in on, and one that I personally have questions about, is pronoun assumptions. So I know that out of human nature and just because of how we've been raised, our initial response is to make these types of assumptions. But when we're starting the conversation, should the first interaction with employees or candidates be always that you just use a they, them pronoun, or should the first interaction be asking the question as to what they'd prefer to be using?
Well, we always encourage, rather than being invasive and asking people questions, like I said, either offering the information about yourself first and creating a space for other people to provide that information as well. Sometimes employers are nervous about things like putting pronouns on email signatures or introducing oneself with them in a meeting because they worry about people being nervous about engaging in that practice. I think obviously you just don't ever want to force people to do anything that they don't want to do, but just create the space for people to do it if it's something that they think that they need. If there's somebody who uses they, them pronouns, they're likely misgendered often in their daily life, and they would probably really appreciate the opportunity to be able to offer up that they use they, them pronouns to mitigate any other misgendering in the future. So just creating a space for people to be able to engage in that practice is helpful. But you don't want to get into a situation where you're saying, well, now everybody's putting it on their email signature, because not everybody feels comfortable explaining the reasons why maybe the company is doing that. And it puts individual employees in an awkward position if they don't have the knowledge to speak confidently about the practice. So we always just say, create the space for people to engage in those practices if it's something that they feel they need to communicate effectively with colleagues and clients.
Fair enough. So it sounds like the underlying theme to dealing with employees is more so to have an open, receptive, and welcoming environment rather than trying to force or impose upon people to participate or give information about themselves that they otherwise don't need to. And on that point, one of the questions that came in, and this is more for Michael, is what can we ask in terms of employee candidate disclosure, and what are employers allowed to do with that information? Obviously, a lot of people are working towards trying to have a more diverse employee base, but obviously there's legal issues surrounding that as well.
Yes, and this is one of those situations where both answers are correct. You've got situations, and maybe it's an approach situation. Clearly, under the Ontario Human Rights Code, diversity hiring or inclusionary hiring is promoted. If you've got a policy with respect to trying to go towards inclusionary hiring, that is a permitted process under the Human Rights Code. However, similarly, the difficulty is often going to be at the point of the a candidate application itself, because you don't want to be asking questions that lead to disclosing information that, unfortunately, the candidate is going to be considering this to be a disclosure that may preclude them from being considered from employment. And that historically has been the case, that when you ask questions such as marital status, children, age, all those have typically been barriers to hiring as opposed to promoting hiring. And so we've got to step past that. I think the best approach for companies, though, from a first step perspective, as opposed to putting the onus on the candidate, look within your own organization, and if diversity and inclusionary hiring is where you're going towards, think about the construct of your actual hiring teams. Look at them. Get a diversity with respect to that. You'll find that if you look at the persons who are actually receiving the applications, who are doing the interviews, who are doing the consideration and debate, if you've got more people of diverse backgrounds there, that's going to promote diversity hiring, because now you're already coming from a bigger and better knowledge pool as to how applicants are coming in. If on the legal end, with respect to this is a priority for your organization, then I would recommend two things. One, don't have it in the application process itself, but after interviews have been done, that you can then interact with the individuals and get consent to disclosure, and also be able to explain to them that the reason you're asking for this disclosure is because you have a policy that you're trying to implement with respect to inclusion and diversity in the workplace, and share that policy with them. And in that way, you can then get the information after they're already into the process, so they don't feel that they're disclosing information that is actually would otherwise be information that typically would have precluded their participation. So I think the approach in this concert at this point in time is to work from the inside out as opposed from the outside in.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. So another one for Colin. A question came in, what is the most appropriate term to address the community? So you touched on this earlier. Obviously, there's various letters that you can use. From what it sounded like, there wasn't really a wrong answer, but at the same time, there are certain phrases that people more typically use. Maybe if you could just kind of look over that again.
Yeah, there's no global standard, so there's no organization that defines what acronym you're supposed to use. So if somebody tries to assert that they have the be-all and end-all of these acronyms, you can tell them that I said they're wrong. Every organization makes decisions. There's an organization in the UK called Stonewall the acronym they used to use was LGB because they only served folks on the basis of sexual orientation. They had to change the acronym once they started doing programming around folks who are trans or non-binary or identified as queer. So they use a much longer acronym now, and that really just reflected the grounds and the identities that they did work on. So some organizations, they like to use a big long acronym because they feel that it's more inclusive. I personally feel that you can have the longest acronym in the world. You're still not going to capture all of the identities that I've ever seen within the community, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of organizations move to broader terms that focus more on grounds, like saying gender and sexual minorities, where you're focusing a little bit more on the grounds. You say queer, trans, two-spirit communities, so that you're just kind of encompassing some of the umbrella terms that we use in the community. But really, if it's in relation to an internal educational program or an employee resource group, it's good to go to the folks who are going to be actually engaging in the work and say, well, what do you think we should be called? Some organizations say pride community. I think people who are members of the community or allies to the community, they can work with the organization to find out what's going to message their commitment to diversity and inclusion the best. And just be open to it changing. There's some organizations that used to use LGBT, now use LGBTQ or even longer. So just kind of revisit it every so often. Think about some of the conversations that you're having on a consistent basis, and just be open to that constant transformation of the way that you talk about the community, because this language is changing at a really rapid pace.
Well, thank you very much for that. And now another one for Michael. There's a few questions coming in regarding employee resource groups and how you can set up those types of groups without forcing it on members of the community or making employees feel like they need to be participating. Obviously, this goes back to the theme of just being open and welcoming and receptive to it. But how would you go about starting these types of groups? And maybe give a bit of insight as to how it would work for a larger corporation, but also for smaller organizations as well, how you can take those steps.
Well, often the best step is just to invite the process. So particularly where you're reaffirming or introducing a policy, or because you constantly should be engaging in training and retraining with respect to your diversity, inclusion, harassment, discrimination policies, and within the workplace, take that opportunity to invite individuals to come forward and say, we would like to promote this as a process. We want to know who our employees are interested in coming into an employee resource group, and see what the temperature is with respect to that. You hopefully, and that works for both large and small organizations. You may want to identify a key person within management who can at least spearhead that opportunity and say, I'm starting an employee resource group. Yes, it's part of management, and it's not necessarily beneficial to have it start from the top down, but oftentimes that's the kickstart that you need. So you have an individual within management who says, I'm going to start this. I'd like people to participate and make inquiries as to individuals. They can be open-ended, or quite frankly, if you find that the open-ended approach doesn't introduce anyone, make directed contact with individuals and say, would you like to be part of this team, and grow it that way. It's like any other, quite frankly, it's like the Joint Health and Safety Committee or any other workplace committee. Oftentimes you'll find that you've got lots of volunteers, and other times you'll find that you need people to give a push, because people have busy lives and they don't necessarily want to avail themselves within the workplace. They're sort of, they just don't want to participate until they get that push, and then you'll find that they're sometimes the most committed people to the process. And I think those are a couple of options and opportunities that you have. So if it's not going to happen on an invitation basis, then as a management, try to have someone spearhead it and see if that can spur action by individuals.
Fair enough. Another question that's come in that I didn't even think about previously is about the benefits industry, saying that a lot of members of the benefits industry still require employers to provide the gender as it's assigned at birth. Are you aware of any developments in the law or progress in that area where the benefits industry, the insurance industry, is kind of moving on that point?
No, I don't. In some sense, this is sort of a catch-up situation for the insurance industry, and they've They've had other issues with respect to catch-up because oftentimes they're sort of focused on forms and process internally as to looking at what the actual information they actually need in order to facilitate their support. For employers, two things. One, remember, insurance benefits, they're your clients. So you've got some power here because they're supposed to be working for you and helping you. And secondly, it's clearly appropriate for you to say, well, why do you need this information? If they can provide an explanation as to why sex, for example, or gender identity is necessary, then it may need to be provided. Clearly, age is one of those ones that has to be provided because it can lead to cutoff with respect to benefits at age 65, which is still permitted. But other questions probably don't need to provide it. If it's with respect to marital status, you can then start to use more broader terms with respect to marital status as opposed to spouse, husband, wife. Eliminate that. Go to spouse as a neutral term.
So to an extent, do you think a lot of the changes might be client-driven? If employers are pushing back against insurance companies saying, well, why do you really need this information? It'll kind of cause them to relook at their policies and maybe make those changes internally.
Absolutely. I think that there's a situation where oftentimes the forms lag behind real-world changes, and if you're identifying these for your clients, particularly in the insurance industry, you'll find that changes are going to be made.
All right. One last question, and this is, I guess, open for both of you. How would you deal with a situation where employees are expressing that they're uncomfortable working with other employees that are part of the community? Like, obviously, from my perspective, this would be a bit of intolerance being expressed by members of your workforce, but it creates conflict internally, and how should that be addressed in today's world?
Well, I'll take the first crack at this. First off, I think employers and human resources, they should be direct. This is not going to be acceptable within the workplace. Get an understanding as to what, quote, the uncomfort is. You should allow the employee the opportunity to explain if they can explain. But at the end of the day, your policy, your procedure trumps any other concern of morale or uncomfort from another employee. It's as simple as that, and I think that really managers should be direct in that if they're facing that within the workplace. That you're not a workplace that is going to tolerate discrimination, and if that's the situation, then this is not a workplace for them to continue working at.
Fair enough. Any thoughts, Colin?
No, I couldn't agree more. Just because somebody is uncomfortable working with another individual for any reason doesn't mean that the company gets to make sweeping decisions based on that one employee's discomfort. I think just from cultivating a better environment, find out where that discomfort comes from. Perhaps remind them that over half of the members of this community that we work with are not out to anybody that they work with in Canada. So chances are they're already working with several members of the community, and they just don't know that person's a member of the community because they're not out at work. So maybe just try and get to the heart of where that discomfort is coming from, what education, what training, what kind of opportunities can be provided to the employee to maybe change their perspective so that they can choose to stay in the workplace instead of choose to leave.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Okay, so another reminder, we encourage you to keep sending your questions in so we can continue this conversation. I want to thank Colin again for taking the time to come to speak with us today here at Urban Berlis to give his insights and information on the issues at hand. So thank you very much, Colin.
Thanks for having me, and happy Pride.
And to everyone, have a good Wednesday, and we'll see you next